I'm Jen Kaifesh. I think you've been to a lot of these. I saw a lot of names on here that have been to a lot of our webinars. So thanks for popping into everything. But I'm the owner and founder of Great Expectations. And as I think most of you know, we do a lot of these with Pally High and try to keep everybody in the loop on all the things that are ever changing in the landscape. But let's jump in. So right now, everyone knows that the landscape for testing has changed significantly. One of the things I wanted to cover tonight is also how APs factor into that, because that's kind of shifted the weight of that, but it'll primarily be focused on SAT, ACT, PSAT stuff even as well. But one thing I also want to point out, there are people, you guys are very equally balanced between, seniors, juniors, sophomores, freshmen, and even some younger. So I'm going to try to speak to all grades, and I'll be more clear when it's about specific grades, because there are some that are relevant or not as relevant to different ages. So, okay. So when we talk about standardized testing, there's kind of the two categories. There's the AP exams and SAT, ACT. The only reason here I show SAT, ACT as more important is that more people generally take that than necessarily take APs. But if you are in the category where your APs are doing well in this kind of more test optional world, the APs carry a lot of weight. There are some schools that will even say, if you submit AP scores, we don't care as much about SAT or ACT. Obviously, a lot want both if you have them, but just know that these are two different categories. But the idea of both is the same. It's how do you compare to the rest of the country? So when people talk about why do standardized test scores matter, my kid has good grades, the reality is your grades compare you to your peers. And it's also more subjective. So when you have a teacher who loves you, you might get an A even though you didn't put much work in, or because the teacher was easy and didn't really actually teach you much. They just gave everybody A's. Or the opposite, right? You could have a bad grade from a teacher who didn't like you, or you bombed one single test, and their project, and that's what brought your grade down. The idea of standardized testing is a chance to say, compared to everyone else, where do I fall? And APs and SAT, ACT do the same thing in that way, but in different ways. So APs are very specific, right? It's going to be within the subject that you're studying and the class you're in. SAT, ACT is more general knowledge. So when we talk about why to take APs, one thing I always want to remind people is that APs, sometimes it's about, yes, showing course rigor and stuff like that. That was a different webinar. But for this, it is also to show them how much you actually learned in the class based on the exam score. So knowing that more people are taking APs than ever before, we have a lot of kids who come to us and say, do I need to take the exam if I get an A in the class? But knowing there's all these other kids out here, and this is last data they've released is 2018, it's like 2022, you can expect is going to be significantly higher again. And more kids are out there taking it. If they're taking an AP class and sending scores and you're the one not sending scores, it either looks lazy or it looks like you did poorly, right? So just know that because these are becoming so common and so valuable for colleges to get more information, you want to take the exams whenever possible. Here's a list of courses. So for those of you who are seniors, this is a done deal. For those of you who are freshmen, this is something that you can kind of just get a sense of what's out there. And, when we have like the webinar on freshmen, sophomores, and high school, we talk more about how you kind of plan out your APs and what to look for. For those of you who are juniors and seniors, again, you probably either, if you're senior, you're done. Juniors, you kind of know where you're headed, but just keep in mind that those AP scores matter a lot. Now for seniors, one of the things I hear all the time, do my AP scores matter from senior year? Yes and no. They made a decision about you before you even test, and you don't get the results until July after you graduate. So they're not making a decision based on the AP scores from that class. So if senioritis kicks in and you do poorly or you sleep in and forget about it, it's not going to hinder necessarily your ability to get into a college, but it will hinder your ability to test out of material or test into higher level, whatever it is, and get more credits, right? Because the college credits come from your AP exam scores. So AP scores. So just going through these again, I know we've covered these in other webinars. I don't want to be redundant for those of you who've attended the others, but for people who are new, recognizing that it's scored 1 to 5. So these AP tests that you take, if you get a 1 or a 2, it's like getting a D or an F. We don't tell anybody about it, right? They don't need to know. So this would be one of the only times I would say don't send your scores, is if you get a 1 or a 2. 4s and 5s are going everywhere. Everywhere will be extremely impressed with a 4 or a 5. It's, as you can see, kind of getting between an A and a B, depending. And also if you can Google this if you're ever interested, it's not necessarily relevant right now, but if you're curious, you can find out the breakdown of how many kids in a certain subject typically get 5s, typically get 4s. For instance, some of the foreign languages that are a little bit more niche, where if you're taking, AP Korean, most people who are taking that are native speakers. So most people get 5s. It was like 70%, I think, get 5s, like basically a perfect score. But when you get to AP Physics, or you get to other things like that, the proportionality is a little bit different. Colleges know this. So I only mention it that if you're taking a test and you're like, was a 4 good on this? You can always Google that and get a sense of, what do most people get and how do those scores break down on AP US history, right, or whatever. But 4s and 5s you send. 3s are always the question mark. Generally, the answer is you send them. So the vast majority of colleges still will give you credit for 3s. They're happy with 3s. The only problem with the 3 is if you're applying to like top 10 schools that really only want 5s, right? And even 4s are like a little iffy. The 3 is not great. You can see it's kind of like a low B to a C equivalent for a college class. That's the idea of these grades. But a 3, if you don't put a 3, they might think it's a 1 or a 2. So just know if you do test and you get a 3, the odds are you're sending it everywhere. If you're applying to top schools, it's up to you if you want to pretend you were sick that day, or let them know about the 3s. Don't panic if you've got 3s. 3s are still really good scores. It's just that cuspy, not incredible, but not bad. So that's one thing about the APs. Okay, enough about APs, but I just wanted to cover that because we get so many questions about how important those AP exams are. So PSAT, and I know a lot of you just took it if you're on the younger side, and let's talk about some basics that some people just don't really, and rightfully so, don't understand. It's a very confusing process. So first of all, there's multiple levels of the PSAT. So there's the PSAT 8-9, which is meant for 8th, 9th graders to test out the PSAT and see how they feel. PSAT 10, obviously meant for 10th graders. Neither of those have anything to do with the National Merit Scholarship Program. So when you hear people saying like your PSAT score is what gets you, in the running for national merit, it has to be from 11th grade. So the official PSAT, there's no 11 in front of it because it's just the PSAT, it's the official one. That's the only route of entry to be considered for national merit. So I bring this up because if you're on the younger side and you're wondering if you should take the PSAT or you should prep for the PSAT, the reality is your PSAT does not matter in 8, 9, or 10. That's just for fun, right? That's for you getting used to the test, seeing how you do standardized testing. Are you good at it? Do you struggle with it? It's very helpful, but don't put too much weight on it, because if you got a perfect score on your PSAT in 10th grade, no one knows. It doesn't help you. No one sees it. Doesn't matter. So one of the other things is I think the timeline for national merit that people get thrown off. But if you think about this from realizing it's junior year that matters, it makes a little more sense. So for instance, here, the 2022 PSAT, so the one that juniors just took, that PSAT is the qualifying test for entry for National Merit Scholarship Program that's awarded in 2024. And we'll break down the timeline a little bit momentarily, but it's a long process for them to like get through everything. And then there's stages and phases of this. So anyways, so be just aware of the 8, 9, and 10 don't really matter or don't matter at all. It's just good practice. And if you can take them, great. If it's ever a problem, don't stress about those. Now, scores are out of 15, 20 because they're jerks. They used to always be the same as SAT, and a few years ago, they decided to be like, let's make it different. I think they were tired of people confusing the scores. But this also means that if somebody gets a 1480 on the PSAT, that's way better than a 1480 on the SAT, right? Because you have 80 fewer points here that you can even get. So just keep that in mind when you're hearing scores for PSAT scores, that it's out of 1520. Selection index is a phrase that's thrown around a lot that people don't really understand. It's, again, an unnecessarily complicating factor when it's really just your score. But what they do instead is they double the sum of the reading, writing, and language and math test scores. So you end up, it's out of 48 to 228. And the whole idea of that is that's the number that for your state is used to determine national merit. So we'll break this down a little bit more because this is something that most people just, and half of us, every year we have to go back and be like, when does this happen and how many people? So you take the test in, October, just as you did. So program notification is the next fall. It can happen this year. I think it happened in August. So it was a little bit sooner, but you're waiting a while. So just get comfortable. But there's roughly 1.5 million kids. This is from like last year's data, but 1.5 million kids who take the PSAT junior year, 50,000 are recognized, right? So you get recognition. Of those, 34,000 are going to be commended students. They find out usually a few weeks later. But here's the funny part. The semifinalists find out earlier, which is a more fancy thing. I think it's that they want to get the people who, because if you're a commended student, you're just done. Like, that's it. That's saying, it's an honorable mention, basically saying, thanks for playing. You did a great job. You're, top 34,000 out of 1.5 million, basically. We appreciate you. Semifinalists, it's only 16,000 out of that 50,000 that were acknowledged for recognition. But here's where it gets interesting. Everybody thinks semifinalist to finalist is a big jump. It's not. Most people who are semifinalists become finalists for PSAT or for national merit. So of the 16,000, 15,000 of those become finalists. Really, all that gets weeded out are kids who have really low GPAs or can't do as well on the next test. So you have to basically validate the score that it wasn't a fluke by taking another SAT or ACT. And once you take that, they say, are you in the same ballpark? Like, was this a complete fluke? Are you still really good at testing? Are you the same person? All of these things. And if you pass that and you have a certain GPA and you've got some activities and things like that, you make it to finalist, which most people who are going to make semifinalists are there. That's why you see the vast majority make it all the way to finalist. Now, winners is give or take half of that, right? And then so semi-finalists to finalists, you've got a big gap because they need to review everybody's applications and GPAs and stuff. And then it's another couple months to decide who wins the scholarship money. So that's a lot of information, but I bring this up because when people say, how important is the PSAT? So first of all, your school wants you to take it. Pally wants you to take it. It's good for them. They get data out of it. A lot of people are going to, want to see where this is. It tells them about the high school, it tells them about you. But the reality is, like I said at the bottom, colleges don't see these scores. These scores don't go anywhere other than to the National Merit Scholarship Program. So the only purpose PSAT really serves is that. So you can do the math, by the way, and sit here and say, like, where do you have to be? So finalists are really top 1%. So when we talk about the selection index, that means what's the top 1% from your state. Every state has a different cutoff, which makes sense, but they break it down by state. So if you look at, I'm trying to think, like Alabama or Mississippi are generally at the bottom. So their selection index is going to be lower. To be top 1%, it requires a lower score. California is generally on the higher end. So I think last year was 220, 221, somewhere in there, out of 228. So when you get your scores, just know that if you're not testing in the top 1%, none of this really matters. So when we have students ask us if we should prep for PSAT, the first question I ask is, if you're not top 10% on a practice test, probably not worth it, because you might kill yourself and put all this effort into the PSAT and prep. And even if you make 98th percentile, no one knows, no one cares. The exception here is if you know you're going to take the SAT anyways, then prepping for the PSAT is great. Then you may as well do it and just continue along with your prep, and why not, and tack it on. But if you're taking ACT, pivoting and doing PSAT prep, which is completely different, can kind of mess you up strategy-wise and pacing-wise and all the other things, it's not always worth it. So this is something I can answer more questions on. I don't want to spend too much time on, especially since it just happened. But for those of you who are younger in particular, just be aware that this is not, don't put so many eggs in this. People think of this basket as a very important basket to put your eggs in. It is not, unless you can be in that top 1%. If you can, colleges love it. If you notice, top schools on their website will often say how many national merit finalists they had on that in their accepted class. So it's a feather in their cap if you have it. So anyways, that's enough on PSAT. Okay. So this is one we're going to talk about. I'll give you some examples of some schools that have different policies. For those of you who are younger, this is changing year by year. So let's go through kind of what it is today. So first of all, definitions. Test optional means you get to decide whether submitting scores is going to benefit you. Does it improve your application? Do you look better by including this? The example I always give is, I am a terrible artist. If somebody gave me an optional art portfolio, me submitting stick figures would not benefit me at all, right? So there would be no reason for me to send that. If you are an amazing student with a great GPA and a terrible test taker, you may go test optional. You may decide not to submit scores anywhere. We'll come back to when you still might, but that's kind of the gist, is like, will it benefit you? Now, test blind schools is where test scores will not be considered. Even if you got a perfect 1600, they're never going to know. If you look at this list, look for a theme geographically. This is a very California movement. There will be more, and it's going to catch on other places, and there are other schools, but the bulk of them are in California, and specifically Southern California. So other than UCs and Cal States, Caltech to me is the most interesting, because Caltech, so everybody else is test optional in the world, basically. MIT this year went to test required. They hated test optional. They didn't feel like they got the class they wanted. They didn't feel like they, had enough information on their applicants. Caltech went the opposite way. They're like, we're going to go test blind. We don't care about testing anymore. So one of the kind of misconceptions I hear a lot is that, good schools require them, or, this caliber of school or this type of school does or does not. Caltech and MIT are perfect examples that there's no rules to this. It really comes down to who's running admissions and how they view testing. And candidly, from a lot of conversations I've had, a lot of it comes down to how that person tested when they were in high school. Because the number of times I've heard somebody say, well, I was a great student, but I wasn't a good test taker. And so people who run admissions like that oftentimes go test blinds or stay test optional. But you see more old school people who believe in standardized testing and think it's a good gauge of where people are more likely to move back to test required. So testing required says ACT and SAT must be submitted. You don't have a choice. Georgetown, MIT, Georgia Public Universities, Florida Public Universities. There will be more after 2023, but these are ones that were like, you gotta send scores. We need more information. We're not happy with the application process without it. So if you are a senior and you're applying to any of the schools listed there, you need to have scores. If you are younger, then let's just say you're thinking you don't want to test. You have to decide how comfortable are you maybe losing schools on your list and having to drop them off if you don't test and actually prepare. So the beauty of test optional is that if something is test optional, you get to choose whether you submit, but you don't necessarily know who's going to be test optional if you're on the younger side once you apply. So as the note says, most schools have announced policies through 2023. Like UC's, Cal States, they're kind of indefinite. They're saying we're going to be test optional moving forward, or sorry, test blind moving forward. So there's no really urgency about that. If that changes, there will be notification and an update. There's been chats. They've been talking about maybe having their own test and making their own test. So this whole movement about no tests, they're realizing they still want information. But if you're on the much younger side, this might affect you. If you're a junior or even a sophomore, it probably won't. Anyways, but so knowing the policies, so when COVID happened, most places only went through 2023. They're like, we don't know what we're going to do past that. We want to see how this goes. So some schools have been happy with the classes they've gotten from test optional. And they're like, it's such a diverse group. We're getting so many interesting people. We love this. And then again, you look at Georgetown and MIT and they're like, terrible, didn't like that, never doing it again. So I bring this up because if you are thinking about keeping your options open, you want to test, because you just don't know beyond 2023. And by the way, they don't have to announce this until August 1st of next year. So if you're a junior, basically you're waiting 10 more months, right, to get an answer. Then that's too late. You don't want to start prepping that far into senior year. Your entire college list should be prepared. You should know where you're at with all these things. So I bring this up that if you're somebody who's comfortable saying, I hate testing, I'm not good at it, I don't want to do it, which of course nobody likes it, by the way, to be clear. But if you're like, this is not for me, that's fine, but you're going to end up eliminating options at some point, somewhere, some school, maybe a lot of them, maybe some, maybe zero if you're lucky, but the odds are you're going to eliminate options. Again, especially if you're on the younger side, because this trend to go back towards testing required is coming up. But let's talk about test optional a little bit more. Test optional, one of the examples that kind of to set this up and make sense of who should do this and who shouldn't. If you are applying, let's say you're applying to a school that has an average GPA for incoming freshmen of 3.8, and your weighted GPA is a 4.2. You would have to test better than the equivalent of a 4.2, right? So really well, really impressive score to benefit your application. You were already above average. My instinct is don't mess with that. Right. So your safety schools, if you now, and we're speaking to people who are not great testers. If you're a great test taker, by the way, even if you're lazy and don't want to test, if you're good at it and can do well, especially with test prep, take them. Because all you want to see here, anything you can do to increase your chances and give them more data, they're going to appreciate. So if you apply, let's say that same school, 3.8 is what they're looking for, you have a 4.2, and you have a 1500 on the SAT, you're shoo-in now, basically, right? You're so above what they're looking for. The lack of a test score shouldn't really hurt you, but a good test score will help you. One of the things that I also hear people say, which I want to clarify. So let's just pick two schools that if you look at their ranges, let's say on ACT, they're saying their range is a 27 to a 30. One school, so school number one is test required. If you're in that range of 27 to 30, submit it, because that's the 25th to 75th percentile. So there's 25% lower, 25% higher. That's what that generally means when you see that range. So if you even have that low 27 out of the 27 to 30, it's good enough, send it for test required. If you were applying to a test optional school, here's where things get a little bit messy. Kids are only sending scores if they're on the high end of the average. So if you sent a 27 in, you're one of the only ones probably submitting a 27. Otherwise, people are going test optional and only submitting 29s, 30s, and higher, right? So the test optional actually drives up the score averages. So this is something, when you're seeing some of this stuff, recognize that's why, is people are holding back scores if they're not higher than average, which of course becomes the new average the next year. So this is one factor when you're looking at it, trying to decide whether you want to submit it or not. But I think the big thing is, if you have a lower GPA, so same example, school wants a 3.8, you have a 3.5. If you don't submit good test scores, you're gonna have a hard time, because you're showing that you're below average academically, or at least in school. So you need something else to show them that you can compete, that you're gonna be in it with all of the other, kids there and you can hang. So if you can test well, then you can send that in. So again, let's say their average is a 27 to 30, you can pull a 32 or even just a 30 be on the high end, but you had that 3.5. Now you're a much more kind of target candidate. So think of it that way, is that if your GPA is above average, then you probably need to do it less so. If your GPA is below average, you probably have more need for really good scores. But if your scores aren't above average when your GPA is below average, then it's the kiss of death if they're both below average, right? I mean, shouldn't say kiss of death. There's plenty of exceptions. You could have amazing extracurricular activities, great essays, all the things, but you generally want one of them above that school's average when you're applying. So that's the kind of the gist of the terminology and the rules and what you see there. Let's talk a little bit about the tests and when it's good for you to take it, when it's not, and we'll talk about timeline down here in a sec. But the difference between the tests, I think the most important thing for you to do is to identify which test plays to your strengths. So one of the things we see a lot is kids who say, I want to take the SAT. My parents say it's more valued by colleges, or my parents took it, or my older brother who's 10 years older took it. That's fine. Times are changing. ACT is a more popular test, just number-wise of the number of kids who take each test. But more importantly, it's not more popular, that's not the right word, more accepted applicants at top 10 schools submit ACT than SAT. And I'm only picking on top 10 because I hear people all the time saying, well, good schools want SAT. No, they'll take whichever one. But here's the catch. If you're a naturally great tester, you're probably going to be okay on either of these tests. If you need help with prep, so when we work with students and try to help them pick which test, the thing we always point out is that ACT, 9 times out of 10, the kid with prep, the score does this. It's just a very gradual improvement because it's a very straightforward test. And we'll talk about it in a little more detail in a sec here. But SAT is testing what's the best answer, right? So it's a little bit trickier and a little bit harder to prep for, because when you're reading a Virginia Woolf passage and wondering what the main character might do in a different scenario, it's not like, oh, I learned this, right? It's harder. Reading on ACT, you're pulling from the passage. Everything is in the passage, but it's about more almost speed reading skills. So they're testing different skill sets. So again, I hear people all the time say that sounds like SAT is a harder reading section. Kind of, it's true. But ACT tests a very valuable skill to colleges, which is, I hate to, it's not officially speed reading, but the ability to skim and retain information. Think about, I mean, college in general, the amount of reading you have If you can skim relatively quickly and retain what you're reading, that is a very important skill for colleges. So ACT is a better gauge of, can you do that? Can you pick out the things that matter out of each paragraph, out of each passage? Do you understand kind of where to go back to look for things if you do need to reference something? That's ACT. SAT is denser reading. I'm an English major. I hate half the passages they give. They pick stuff that's usually pretty challenging, not that fun. And you have to, again, there's a lot of what's the best answer and not what's the right answer, which means two are correct, one's better. So when you look at these tests, let's kind of go back. I'm bouncing all over my own bullet points here. From a pacing standpoint, ACT moves a lot more quickly. So if you struggle with timing, ACT might be more of a challenge because it does move faster, but the questions are more straightforward. So SAT gives you more time per question because it's more confusing and more complicated and takes more time to think through. So depending on your style and how you test and how accurate you are when you're, moving at a quick pace, those things factor in. For those of you who have accommodations, any, IEP or 504 at school, any extended time, SAT gives it much more freely. So if you have, a neuropsych report or a doctor's note or anything, generally SAT is pretty accommodating and giving you what you need. ACT, you have to have had accommodations in place at your high school for 12 months. And that's because the test is a timing-based test. So they are trying to keep people from being able to abuse that and just get extra time for the test. So like, we want to see that you've actually needed this in high school, which is fair and a good gauge from my perspective. But that's also something for those of you who are younger, who feel like this is something you need and maybe you've got approved, but you haven't utilized your accommodations at school. Know that ACT, it's not valid if they're not being used in school, I think in at least one class. But you need to have a track record of that. So that's just something. But the point of that is if you do get extended time, ACT all the way. Because if you can give yourself 50 to 100% more time on one of these tests, ACT is the one you want the time on. SAT is still a hard trick question no matter what. The math is quite different. So SAT math tests the application of concepts like to real world situations. So it's a lot of, like here's a sticker on a car for mileage in the city and highway kind of things, or you're doing your taxes and you did something wrong and you're balancing your checkbook. Like these are all the types of examples they give or the questions that they pull from. ACT has some of those. They do exist, but it's more straightforward. It's like, here's a triangle, solve for this. Do you know how to do that? ACT does have more geometry than SAT. SAT has a little bit more kind of light statistics sort of stuff. You don't need to have taken stats, but there are some concepts in there that show up that people are generally a little thrown by, but only a couple questions here and there. The other big difference, SAT has a no calculator section. So you would need to get comfortable with not relying on your calculator for SAT. And SAT has, if you've taken the PSAT or anything, you've seen the little grid-in sections at the end, which it's not multiple choice. So there's a bunch of questions at the end for each math section, calculator and no calculator, where you have to write your answer in, right? So that is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people are great at it, but people who are good at eliminating or kind of strategically going, well, it can't be negative, so it's not this, well, that's elimination. But if you're strategic about the way you go through it, ACT is, I think, much easier. If you're just naturally good at math, don't need your calculator, can do a lot of mental math or hand math, SAT might play to some of your strengths. The grammar question or sections, by the way, are pretty similar. There's not a huge difference between those. That's the one part of each test that's somewhat similar. ACT science section, the biggest thing, does not test science. So this is the hardest thing to break people up. The number of people I talk to who are like, well, I think I like ACT better, but I'm terrible in science and I don't want to take ACT because there's the science section. Science tests your ability to read graphs and charts. It's data analysis. So it's, can you look at a graph and understand which plant grew more, or bird A or bird B flew further during this time of year, right? It's that sort of stuff. There's 40 questions. 2 are allowed to be outside knowledge questions. In their book, it's middle school science. So for those 2, meaning like gas, liquid, solid. Although every once in a while they trick people, maybe intentionally, but also I think they think it's fair game. So there was a test recently that they asked something about the order of planets, and all my kids were like, we didn't know we needed to know that. I was like, well, you did learn it in like 1st grade. I was like, you made your little diorama hanging from your hangers, but most people don't remember that. So there are some things that will trip it up. But again, only 2 out of 40 questions can even be that. So even if you can't remember your order of planets or don't remember what gas, liquid, solid is, you're going to have 38 out of 40 that are just fair game by looking at the graphs and charts. That's it. So here's the score equivalency. You can see on the screen here. So ACT is out of 36, SAT is out of 1600. If you kind of looked at it, you can see kind of the general breakdowns, and take this with a grain of salt also, because there's a little bit of a curve at play with each. So I mentally always think of a 30 as roughly a 1400. You can look at this, that's more like a 31, but it also, last year it wasn't, this year it is. It's just always off by a tiny bit. But knowing that that's it, I think if you are comparing scores, if you took a practice test of each, the biggest warning I can give you is just comparing them, saying, well, according to this chart, you know, let's say you got a 1320 on SAT and only a 27 on ACT. And you're like, well, the 1320 is higher, right? It's equal to a 28. That's not a good way to make this decision. And, you know, a few of you, when we asked what questions people wanted to answer, a lot of people were like, you know, what kind of test prep is good? The first thing I will tell you is that just be careful of anywhere that like has you take a test that's like half SAT, half ACT. You're better at this, take this one. Because what we found is that most people improve more on ACT and do worse on the first test because they don't understand the pacing. So they just run out of time because they weren't paying attention. So the score is lower. And also that science section murders people on the first try, most people, because they don't understand what they're doing. So the score is artificially low. So I always say, if your ACT is higher than SAT, maybe feel comfortable going that direction. But if SAT is higher than ACT, just be aware that there may be some very quick, easy fixes. So for instance, the way we do test prep is we have kids take a practice SAT, practice SAT, practice ACT, and then they review each with the tutor going question by question to figure out why they're missing what they're missing. And the idea behind that is, what is actually playing to your strengths and weaknesses? Are you constantly falling for the what's the best answer questions on SAT, or are you good at those, right? Or the math, no calculator stuff, how much of that's because you, like, I see kids all the time who forgot how to do long division. It's like, well, we can reteach that, right? Would you be good at it? Or is this just a nightmare for you and generally? So when you're picking which one it is, you know, and if you're doing it on your own without any test prep, that's great. But be careful. Don't just look at the scores. Go back through and look at not just what you missed, but the correct answer, why you missed it, figure out what the mistake was, because you will see generally a pattern in the types of questions you're missing. But understand if you're starting to recognize the pattern, because from our experience, SAT kids have a harder time seeing patterns because there seems to be more diversity of question type. It's not as consistent. ACT, there's a pattern in the way they ask things. So you're going to find people or you know, students who are taking this test who, once you realize how they test who versus whom, there's a rule you can use every time you see a grammar question that's testing who versus whom. SAT, it's a little bit more sometimes subtle what they're actually testing. Anyways, but so just make sure you're actually understanding kind of what that is before you make a choice. If you make a choice to go with one test with the thought that you might switch later, start with ACT. Because ACT, given that it is so straightforward, you're learning grammar rules, math concepts, right? Even your basic reading strategies for, you know, standardized tests, all of that applies to SAT. Even the science section, by the way, SAT doesn't have a science section, but it does add graphs and charts to the other sections, even reading, even grammar. So it'll be like, how does the graph support the, you know, the writer's argument? That's basically the same as what the science section is doing. So anything you learn on ACT is 99% of it's applicable to SAT. So that if you took ACT and let's just say you realized you couldn't move fast enough, you kind of plateaued because you can't speed up anymore and maintain accuracy, and you need to switch to SAT, that's okay. You can make that switch. If you start with SAT and hit a dead end, you're going to have to like reverse out of a dead end alley to get back to ACT, because SAT has so many strategies and so many approaches because of the best answer thing. They also have on the reading, which might give some of you students PTSD from the PSAT that you just took, but they do paired questions on reading, which is like you answer a question that it seems complicated enough in and of itself, and then there's a follow-up question of which line gives you evidence for this, which you can use to make the first question easier, but a lot of kids, they just panic and then they get both wrong. But again, if you know you're good at those, then great. But anyways, if you're prepping for them to make all this strategy on like, how do you take advantage of those paired questions? How do you do all these things that are very unique to SAT? Realize it's the wrong test for you. You did waste time if you're moving over to ACT then. So this, by the way, this breakdown, everything we're talking about holds true for the next year, not quite year and a half, well, almost exactly a year and a half, but a little over a year, until the change for the SAT. So the SAT, as many of you know, is going to be changing. So international test takers are the guinea pigs. So somebody living in China or France or wherever is going to have to start taking this new format in 2023. Still waiting on them to send out, so, make some new information and to practice tests online. But the beauty of being in the US is that we have till March of 2024. So you're not going to see this test even in circulation until March 2024. So the SAT in its current form will disappear at the end of 2023. And then the next test is this one. So 9th and 11th graders, you're done. By the time this comes out, you're not prepping anymore. You're not testing. 9th and 10th graders, depending on when you test, which we'll talk about in a second, you'll be the first students who will have access to the new test. So it will be digital. It's going to be on the computer. It's not a paper test. It's still going to be administered at like test sites, going to whatever high school. A lot of people, there's a lot hosted at uni. Some go to, private schools around here host it, but you'll have to drive somewhere. It's not an at-home test. So a lot of people have thought this means they can just use their own computer at home. Incorrect. Now you can use either your own device or school issued device to take the test. So you can bring your own laptop in theory, waiting for them to decide that opens up cheating. We'll see. But as of now, you can use your own device and school issued devices to take it. The test will be shorter. This is the one thing that is really nice. So the test right now is a little over 3 hours. It's going to be 2. So they're trimming and consolidating and saying, you don't need to stay here for this long. Let's cut each section down. And the reading is going to become shorter reading passages. So and then fewer questions also. So it's both. Here's the big change. And this is the thing that makes us as test prep experts like a little nervous, is that adaptive testing. So for those of you who've taken the LSAT, taken any kind of grad school stuff, this is saying that you're going to have subjects are divided into 2 sections. How you perform on the first section determines what level section you get for the second section, which means the first section will be easy. If you get all of them right, let's say you get 100%, they're gonna be like, great, we can move this kid to the really hard stuff. So in order to get an 800, right, a perfect math score on that, you would have to then continue and get all the hard ones right and do great. But if you missed number 2 because you dropped a negative sign or you said 2 + 3 = 6, they're gonna go, oh, this kid's not great at math. And then the next section you get will not be the hardest math. It will be a step down depending on how many you missed and which ones you missed, and will limit how high your score can go. So this is something, and they haven't released the breakdown yet because they haven't released much at all. But when you look at some of those grad school tests and adaptive testing for adults, fine, I get it, it makes sense. But for kids, this is going to be tough because it just means there's no room for error. You cannot make silly mistakes, which in theory you shouldn't be making anyways. We don't want 2 + 3 = 6 on standardized tests. But just know that adds, so anybody who has test anxiety, anybody who has kind of, any challenges with testing in general, I think this is going to be a big problem. But we'll see once they release more sample tests and we can kind of get our hands on a lot of the materials, we'll be able to know more. But what we're generally telling people is that if you're in 9th or 10th grade and you hate the ACT for some reason, hopefully you like it and you can just take it and it's easier. But let's just say you take it and you're like, I'll never finish this test. It moves too fast, terrible at this, hate the science section, really want to try SAT. The reality is the current SAT is not great. Like all the tests have their own issues, but try the current one while you can over the next year. And it's really, I guess, 14 months because the last test would be December of 2023. But try to take it then. If you can't do well, then you can always move on to the new digital SAT that's coming out. But it's just to put all your eggs in that basket to say, I'm going to wait for the digital one because it's shorter and I like it. Be careful because you may hate that test. And also there's not going to be as much material out there. That's the bigger concern. So if you're, 6th grader listening to this, great. By the time you want to take it, we and every test prep company in the world is going to know everything we need to know about the test. But if you don't want to be the guinea pigs, in my opinion, unless there's a reason you really think this is going to play to your strengths. So just food for thought, and that's my personal opinion on it. So let's talk about when to do this lovely testing. So I highlighted and read SAT, ACT, but if you notice on here, grade out. So sophomore year, we talk about PSAT prep. again, we don't really recommend that. It's something that we're not going to discourage it if somebody wants to do it because they want to feel more confident going in to take it and then get a better gauge of where they're really testing. That's totally great. Just don't put too much pressure on yourself. AP prep, sophomore year, if you're taking APs, then you're going to be doing that in the spring. But here's what I want to point out. I always put everything starting kind of the end of sophomore year, beginning of junior year, summer. So starting in July, you start prep, and then you prep in the fall of junior year. But let's backtrack and explain who should be doing this and who should be going earlier and who should be going later. So the most important thing is Algebra 2. So if you have Algebra 2, done in your back pocket, you took it as a freshman, or if you're a junior, you took it as a sophomore, you're ready whenever Algebra 2 is done. So if you are an advanced math track, I have a lot of kids, candidly, who take this test in sophomore year. So they are done with standardized testing before junior year even begins, which sounds crazy. And people are always like, well, I thought you're supposed to wait. And our school says this. The reality is, one of the most kind of, to me, false arguments I hear a lot is that you're going to be a more mature test taker when you get older. Yes, maybe, but marginally. So it's not like you're learning how to take standardized tests a lot in school, and not like you're taking a lot of tests like this in school anyways. And the reality is, you're not going to learn grammar if you haven't learned it yet. And, the science section is not going to suddenly miraculously appear in your studies. And sure, maybe learning a couple different graphs in science class will help with a couple questions. It's math that determines how ready you are. And by the way, same with reading. I always hear people say you're going to get better at reading as you go through high school. It's like when you're reading like a couple paragraphs about how killer bees mate, your AP English class did not help with that. So it's just a different skill set. Math, though, is the thing that gauges how ready you are. So if you are, again, done with Algebra 2, junior year, let's say freshman year, you could prep sophomore year and be done. And we have a lot of kids who hit their score by the holidays sophomore year. They're done. They never have to test again. And you can use that score. I think it's for 4 years. So you're totally fine. If you take it in high school, there's no point at which it's going to expire. But I bring this up because what happens is a lot of kids don't know this, and they wait until end of junior year to prep. And now they're 2 years past the math that's actually on the test. So if you start taking pre-calc, AP calc, and you're about to start senior year with multivariable calculus, and you're trying to remember pre-algebra, the number of kids I've seen who don't remember how to add fractions, who are in high level maths, because they haven't had to do it in years, right? It's not that they've never learned it or don't know how, it's that they don't remember. So you don't want to get too far past the math that you are going to be tested on, which is through Algebra 2. Okay, so that's if you're in the advanced math track. If you're in Algebra 2 as a junior, then what I recommend is not starting first semester, but starting to, if you're going to prep, start prepping second semester, because you still need to review the other 3 years of math that are on there. So pre-algebra, algebra 1, and geometry. You have lots of formulas, lots of concepts that need to be tested. Grammar rules, learning, again, who versus whom everyone loves, or how to properly use a dash in a sentence, things like that. There's a lot of things like that you just need to start covering anyways. So start reviewing that stuff as you're finishing up Algebra 2 in class. And then you might take the April, there's an April ACT, there's or a March and May SAT, there's June for both. There's a lot of testing in the spring, but you could start, even if you tested in April while you're in Algebra 2, the reality is there's a few concepts maybe that could have helped you on a couple questions by June, by the time you're done with school. So you've learned most of what you need to know by that point. So our recommendation is get done as soon as you can. So if you're seniors, just, close your ears, plug your ears, cover your ears, whatever it is. Try not to be prepping or testing in senior year. It adds stress. If you are a senior, you know that right now. You've got all your essays and applications. You've got the hardest classes you've ever taken. You're juggling so much. You want testing done before senior year if you can possibly make that happen. The only exception when that usually can't happen is kids who are taking Algebra 2 as seniors, because if you don't, you're just going to be really far off. And then you need to at least get a couple months of Algebra 2 under your belt. But the other option there, just for any of you who are in Algebra 2 as a senior, you could take the ACT, which has less Algebra 2, more geometry, and probably kind of balance that, because you're probably not looking for a perfect 36. So you're probably going to be able to get a really solid score, or you are able to get a solid score without that. Now, back to junior year here, though. So PSAT prep, again, we talked about this. If you're planning on taking the SAT, sure, prep for the PSAT. I think that's great. But if you're going to prep for ACT, only consider prepping for that PSAT as well. if you're going to be if you're already kind of in that top 90th percentile or higher when you take practice tests. If you're not, just I would say don't take the time to prep, because you're putting too much effort into something that doesn't actually carry that much weight. Then, an AP prep, we talked this on here again, kind of faded out because it's not as important, but it's still important, is that if you are in an AP, we talked about the importance of those exams. Don't wait until the week before to cram. Make sure you understand the format of the test, that hopefully your teacher's giving you a ton of AP practice tests and scoring you based on the rubrics of the AP exams and how College Board actually scores it. But if not, do some on your own, right? Get that, whether you get a tutor, whether you do it on your own out of a book, that's fine. Just don't wait until right before the test. Start reviewing earlier, and then it's going to be much easier to take it. Now, I think that is it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else with timeline. I think that was it. If I missed anything, I'm sure I see we got questions, so ask away. What do we got, Lauren?
We do. Thank you. The first one is, have notifications for commended students gone out yet?
Commended students, they should have. I'm trying to think. They should have by definition of the dates, but I would say you could probably check on the website to see for 2022. The only reason I'm saying should have also is that I know kids who are semifinalists have been notified. So in theory, that's supposed to happen first, but they're not that far off. So I would expect if one happened, the other probably has, but that's something that you could probably check on the website. Sorry, I wish I knew that off the top of my head for sure. Semifinalists I know have been notified, that for sure.
Perfect, thank you. And this may have been answered already, but what ACT score is a good score to submit to test optional colleges?
Totally depends on the school. It's a great question, but this is where when we were talking about like what their range is, right? So if they're saying their range is 27 to 30, 29 is probably the lowest you'd want to send, because you don't want to be on the lower end of that 50th percentile because no one else is submitting at a test optional school. So it depends on the range, but if their range is 33 to 35, right? If you're looking at like a Stanford or a Penn or something like that, then you want to be at least a 34. So it just depends when you see their ranges, just make sure you're on the high end for it. But that ranges wildly. There's some places that will be giving you a full ride if you have a 27, others that won't look at you if you have a 27. So you just need to kind of look at it in the context of the school.
Perfect. If you take both or take one of them twice, do test mandatory schools see all the scores?
This is a great question. I should have covered this. So thank you whoever asked this. Okay, so horrible answers, it depends. But what I would say is, first of all, if you take both, no, you get to pick which one, because you get to self-report. This is one thing, I'll take a minute to explain this, because this is something that's new since COVID. It used to be that you had to pay to submit your scores to go to colleges. So you'd pay $12 to send a score report to each individual college. It adds up, but you would do that. And so you had control over what went where. What's happening now is that they're realizing that this isn't fair to everybody who can't afford to spend $12 per college. So now they're letting you put your scores on the application. So you will say, here's my highest English score, my highest math score, my highest whatever, and you put it all on there. If you are accepted, then you need to send your official score to validate and prove that you weren't lying. And the whole idea is that way you only have to pay to send it once. Now, that's the majority of schools. There are some schools, Georgetown, which is old school and does things their own way. They are a school that they say they want to see all testing for whichever test you submit. So if you take the SAT, you took it 3 times, you want to send only one, they want to see all 3. It is rare. At this point, very few other schools are doing it that way. So there's very few that are ever going to require it. Now, here's the one thing I will tell you in this digital world, because I've had families say, well, how will they know if we're sending them everything? They know. There's too much digital connectivity. I've seen stuff from the admission side, and some of the stuff that they can see is slightly terrifying. So there's no room for dishonesty on this. Now, with the self-reporting, if you're at a school that says we would like to see, or we encourage you to send, or strongly recommend all the scores, you can just send one. That's totally fine. But point being, just to kind of back to the question. So what was the 2-part question? It was if you take both. Yeah, so I think I answered that, sorry. So if you take both, you get to pick which one you want to tell them about. So you might go SAT sucks, I'm sending my ACT score, but then you have to pay attention to their rules as to whether they want to see all the test dates or not. Keep in mind, a lot of schools are doing something called super scoring, which means, so let's say we're taking SAT, there's kind of that verbal section and the math section, and if you knock math out of the park the first time you take it, but the reading and grammar, the writing sections aren't that great, and you retake it and knock that part out of the park, you can now take the math from the first date, the verbal from the second, and make a higher score, which, by the way, is also why some of the score averages are going up at colleges, because they're kind of creating a new score. But that's one reason that a lot of schools also are kind of fine with whatever you send. They're letting you super score, make your own score anyways. So they're a little less rigid than they used to be.
Thank you. And our last one is, do test optional schools use scores to determine merit aid?
Good question. So they shouldn't. If they're test optional, that would be really shady. So this is actually one thing we didn't talk about to keep in mind too, is that there are some outside scholarships that if you want to apply for, do want test scores, because they're trying to base it on something. So a lot of like more private scholarships want that. Usually the schools that have test scores, now I'll give you an example of one that kind of throws this off, but generally you're going to be fine. But I would go school by school and say, this is also why we say keep your options open, because it changes year to year. So as of now, I don't know of any test optional schools that require a test score for merit scholarships. Next year, who knows, or 2 years from now. So if you have a younger kid, they're changing every year, because 3 years ago, test optional didn't exist, right? So this is a whole new movement and a whole new change, and every year things are shifting. But one of the things I wanted to mention was that there are some schools and some more specific programs. So like Kelly School of Business at Indiana. If you're looking at something like that, they have something that's like, if you have this GPA, you're okay. But if you have this GPA slightly lower, you need to have a test score of at least a 30 or a whatever. And if not, you have to basically appeal for us to even consider you if you don't have that. So there are also sometimes, and that's what I'm saying, that's a little bit wonky, because you want to make sure that you're not going to be like, oh my God, I needed a test score to be considered for this program. And some some medical, the 5-year medical programs where you end up, or I guess technically 7-year, but more that you skip a year and you jump into medical school senior year. Some of those want test scores. So the more competitive a program is, the more likely they may want scores. But for merit scholarships, they shouldn't require it from you if they're school specific. Outside scholarships might. Again, when in doubt, test, because there are so many times where you're going to say, I wish I had it, even if it's just for one thing. Having it gives you options. Not having it, you're just eliminating possibilities. And again, every year that passes, things are different. So is that it? Anything else?
I believe that is it, Jen. Thank you so much. And if anyone did not get a chance to get their question in, all of our contact information is up on the screen right now. You can email us, call us, set up a consultation with Jen if you would like. And we will also be sending out an email tomorrow afternoon with a recording of the webinar in case you would like to share or review it.
Sounds good. Thank you guys. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you at the next webinar.